He then asked, "Have you ever experienced true love yourself?" Ebony: "Well, it is funny you should say that, because I think the only true love I have ever encountered was with an android," explained the dork. The Zionite looked set to explode with laughter, but seeing the intense look on the dork's countenance, he switched his mood and listened empathetically. The dork continued without even noticing that the Zionite thought it was going to be a joke. Robots were the first machines that we created in our own image, and they were used as dance partners. They were very basic, but useful. All one had to do was whisper into its ear the name of the dance, and the robotized automaton would dance with you through all the sequences that it had in its programming. After a while, they were made into differing sexes to add to the dance experience. They were very useful for training students of dance. I mean, homework had never been so easy, the robot could not falter, well, hardly ever. They were not as perfect as they were to become in their future. Anyway, after a time, they built in a voice box and they changed the material to silicon, so that it was like the skin of our species, and the robots became androids. They created a regenerating battery life that was charged by any form of light, which was activated by microscopic solar panels that were planted in their skin, so they would never shut down, and that gave them immortality, unless of course they were damaged or terminated. It was well documented that the males of our species had written into their genes that they should propagate their genes by planting their seed into as many volatile female hosts as possible within their limited lifetime. Of course, this led to disloyalty within our monogamous society, and at the same time, the females had it written into their genes that they should find the ideal male and settle down. Of course, they both saw things from their own selfish natures. So the females expected the males to be loyal, and the males suspected the females of having countless affairs with their friends. To make this even worse, when the females ovulated, they were attracted to dominant males, and for the other 3 weeks of the lunar month, they were attracted to the submissive provider. Which meant that they either married their perfect man, and masturbated and fantasized on the quiet for 1 week of every month, or they had affairs behind their loyal men's backs. It was well documented that voyeurism was the synthesis. Basically, either member of the species could watch adult movies, go to strip bars, or read adult magazines, and fire up their loins, and then once fired up make love to their partners to sustain their loyalty and hold a good family ethic. However, it soon became apparent that this was a good theory, but it did not stop the promiscuity. So it was then that they decided to legalize prostitution. However, they could not stifle sexual diseases that came with it, because no one would keep to the laws of protection, a condom, because it took away the flesh-on-flesh approach that comes with sex. At the same time, they felt feelings of remorse or jealousy after the acts. So with that development, they created artificial lovers that were a development of the dance android, and this stopped the diseases. Because the lovers were artificial, there was no remorse or jealousy. So they added a basic seducer and/or seduced mode to the dance bots, along with functional genitalia, and that led to the first sexual android. Now, to make it more realistic, they programmed them with the characteristics of the perfect lover. They emulated first-hand research experience that they acquired from field research, surveys, dreams and everyday needs, desires and experiences of the average developmental stages of the males and females of our species. I will give you a rundown from the male perspective, as I am a male, my friend, and it is my story, of course, and is from my viewpoint, he said. Of course, carry on, he replied. And so, he carried on with his lover's tale. The average male went through 7 important stages of development. There were the little boy looking for mother. Basically, they wanted to be looked after and have their chosen female running around after them, meeting their every wants, needs and desires. The hero stage, is where they look up to successful or important people. The trickster, where they go out and play the field, searching through all the volatile women that are there ready and waiting for them. The knight, where they go out to get a job and secure a profession and a home for their future. The king, where they get their perfect job and castle, where they can take their perfect female home with them to settle down with, get married and have kids. The midlife crises. I can't remember the actual name of the archetype, where the kids have grown up and left home, and they feel deflated and frustrated with life and their achievements. So they try to recapture their youth by becoming the trickster once again, chasing all the young women around and acting out like unruly teenagers. Then they became the philosopher king, where their lives begin to settle down and repair and they become more adult and mature, once again dropping their youth-like personas, and get back on track with their lives and expectancies of their adult personas. Finally, the wise old man, where they retire from the rat race, settle down, transcend sex and social frustrations, and they become all-knowing, wise and understanding. So, they constructed sex droids to meet the every need and extramarital desires to correlate with all the stages of the male's social and sexual development. As time went by, the artificial living androids became very sophisticated, and this sophistication opened the gates to artificial intelligence. It was then that the dorks put a limit on their progress, as they tried to keep their intellect restricted. They did not want to create an adverse species that could one day fight with the dorks on who should be the dominant species of the planet. So, they programmed them as sex slaves, not politicians and philosophers. Of course, being artificially intelligent, they were able to learn. However, they built and inserted into their brains an obsessive-compulsive disorder program that was triggered every time they had an original thought or action, a program that would fear independence and any raised voice in any way whatsoever. However, they were not prepared for what all those personified elements would amount to in a sex droid slave. Basically, the obsessive-compulsive paranoid schizophrenic sex droid empathized with their clients' woes. The male sex droids were creative when they used their hypothetical drives and processes to solve their customers' fears, and before long they had established themselves as not just a good commodity, but an out-and-out necessity, the perfect way to wind down at the end of any stressful occupation, or dismal day, or pick yourself up at the beginning of another. It was well documented that they had become self-aware, and the government were monitoring their movements to make sure that they were not overwriting or interfering with their OCD or sex slave program and getting together socially or independent from the brothels to form any kind of artificial intellectual political movement, elite android social uprising, or the potential for an android military rebellion. Ironically, there was another reason why they were not publicly exposed and shut down, and that was because they had become a much-needed drug-like experience that even those at the top depended on. The drug so addictive that if they were taken away, the whole system would have probably came tumbling down. So, to let them be and make sure they did not stray from their purpose was the only solution. Of course, at that time I was totally unaware of any of this, for I was just going to learn about sex, so I could be experienced when I decided to lose my virginity with my own species. So, it was then that I was in a sex parlor with a female sex slave android that I fell in love even before I knew it. This was a love unlike any other. It spanned over 3 life cycles. The first time that I met Ebony was on planet Dork in the physical utopian era. As I have said, she was a pleasure android. Yes, she was made of silicon, and she had the perfect body. I remember our first meeting. I was running the tips of my fingers across the contours of her muscle lines when she began to speak. Her body was bluish-white like a silvery moon. Her eyes were jet black, hence her name. Her artificial intelligence, as I have said, made her appear as if she was truly conscious, and not just a silicon-based machine. So, as I said, we programmed our androids to be the perfect women. They were to be the same psychologically, socially and emotionally as our own women to meet our men's needs. Our women came with 7 different character traits, archetypes, or stages of their personal social development of their own. In a typical heterosexual monogamous relationship, at any given time in their lifespan, they were seen as mothers, sexually provocative female tricksters, sweet, playful companions, perfect partners, and wise old women for those who preferred the mature sex droid. We could activate any of these traits in the sex droids by our projections of our wants, needs and desires independently and in any given order, or as a combination of these personas, to make the perfect sex droids for the perfectly satisfied customer. He took a pause, and the Zionite was sure he could see an ethereal tear well up in his eye, and then he continued, "Well, she had been programmed not just as the perfect lover, but to be just like any other female of our species. You know the way females like to talk incessantly, and they do not want or wait for a reply." "Aha," the Zionite answered. "Well, she started going on about how I was different from her other clients, and that so was she from the run-of-the-mill android. At first, I just wanted my evil way, so I just responded on impulse. I was caressing her perfect breasts, and just grunting a response. She thought she had my undivided attention, and that we had a rapport that went beyond sexual pleasure. She continued talking, and then suddenly, I became aware that she may be an artificial life form built for sexual pleasure, but this female had feelings, emotions, and above all else, insecurities. I suddenly found myself trying to resolve her problems. It is a male trait where I come from. Is it the same for you?" The dork asked. "The same. I think it is universal," the Zionite retorted. She began to say that she had been abused quite a few times by other sadistic males of my species. That they had just seen her as a machine, and that they acted out their perversions relentlessly without a care. She said that because she was a pleasure unit, she had been programmed to feel physical pain and pleasure, so as to benefit the clientele. I was dumbfounded at this, and then she began to show me her repairs, where she had been sewn up. I really began to feel for her. She was crying, shivering and stammering all at once, and I became aware that she had been programmed with emotions intact. As I said, I tried to make things better, as I showed her that I too had physical scars. She didn't stop crying. As I said, she was your typical female. She didn't want answers or her problems solved. She wanted my undivided empathic attention. I found myself cradling her in my arms and telling her to let it all out, let it all go. After a while she began to settle down, and then she began to say that she feared death. I could not believe my ears, and I remember thinking to myself, why did they put this into her program? I told her not to worry, for it was I that would eventually die, and not her, and even if she did, I was sure that there was an android spiritual heaven. She knew this was a lie, you could tell by the look on my face. At that time, we dorks had not obtained physical immortality, and we had thrown away any form of spiritualism out with the dirty laundry. I knew she could see my lie, but she knew that I was only trying to help her, not patronize her. She told me that she could intuitively feel that I was a philosopher at heart. She was not wrong. It was thanks to her constant support, guidance, and her nurturing that brought it alive in me. I did not develop the philosopher fully, though, until our third meeting after the Great War. She went on that she was afraid to speak out, and that she was fearful that if she did, that they would deactivate her if they thought that she was truly alive and conscious. At that time, I was naive to her programming and conditioning, and I tried to console her. She asked me what I think it would be like if they shut down her program, or worse, what if they wrote her off as a sub-program, aware but not able to respond while another program ran, performing her new duties, like a housemaid or chauffeur. I was flabbergasted, and I told her that her secret was safe with me. Further, I would buy her and I would look after her in my home. I said I would put it to the right people, that because of her scars, that she was not very pleasing to the eye for a pleasure unit. Then I would suggest that rather than have her shut down and replaced, I would like to have her as a utility slave in my home, and I am sure they would let me. Even if I have to offer them all my credits and take out a loan, I would save her from her torment. She thanked me and she cried, but this time it was a release of all her bottled up fears and unexpressed emotions, mixed with love and joy of having found a sanctuary. I knew then that this was no ordinary android, and I then became aware that I was falling in love. I cradled her in my arms once more, and she became as happy as a little girl, and passion was the last thing on my mind. She asked me the question again, but this time it was more philosophical than fearful. What did I think it would be like if they shut down her program, or made her dormant, and put another program running in the cognitive part of her psyche? Could I understand what it would be like? The dork was now openly crying. I told her that similar things happen to troubled dorks. That they would find life a little too scary, so they would somehow trick themselves into believing that they had two or more personalities living in the one body. They would create other personalities that could cope with their fears, and when needed, they would then pretend that it was not them, but the other personalities that were coping with their crisis. They would believe it so much, because of their fears of their world, that they would somehow disassociate themselves, and it really was like they had many minds that were independent of each other in one body. I told her that the job of the mind doctor was to help the person overcome their fears, and at the same time, they would talk to all the personalities, as if they really were individual. That eventually they would, if the mind doctor was successful and connected with the shattered person, integrate and become traits, not separate individual personalities. It was then that the mind would regain its integrity once more, and further, it would have solved their fears somewhere along the line, and so the dork could get on with his or her life. She was overwhelmed with emotion at this, and it somehow quashed her fears, and at the same time made her feel more alive, as if she were not just a machine. After that, it was not long before I bought her as I had suggested. She was never my slave. As far as I was concerned, she was alive, not programmed. She had not only my infinite love, but my utmost respect as a living female. We would sit up for hours all through the night talking about all sorts of things. She listened to my problems to no end, and I would listen to her fears and insecurities of being caught. I would listen and not try to solve her fears, for I had learnt that this was the correct procedure. Basically, just let her fears and insecurities run out of steam or verve. She was like a real female. She would even feel unloved from time to time, and that I was taking her for granted like other females from my species that I had dated in the past. Her self-esteem would drop, and then, just when you thought she was going to shut down her program, she would rekindle her feminine passion, flair and lust for life, and become all-giving, all-loving once more. She was better than the average female. She would understand that whenever I had a problem that I, as she put it, would shut down and go inside my mind to solve it. Further, when I would become indifferent to her affection, she would patiently wait, and let me get on with my polar mood swing until I would return liberated, refreshed and all new and loving once more. She would never get in my way even when I blundered my way to an answer, for she knew both outcomes and therefore knew the correct route to take. You see, there was a confusion for the males and females in the type of love that they gave to each other on my planet. The males wanted to be loved by the females in the way in which they loved, and the females wanted vice versa, and so neither were truly satisfied. So, they programmed the sex droids to be able to comply to the client's demands when needed to give true satisfaction, which went beyond the lovers of their species, and it took our love to another level. She sounded like a remarkable woman, the Zionite remarked. She wasn't so much more, the dork replied. She stayed with me to the end, and when I lay there dying in her arms, she told me that energy cannot die, and that I had a soul, or spirit, and that I was going to live on. She also told me that she was a great believer in the grand design, and that everything happened for a reason, and she also believed in reincarnation, and that one day in the future, we would meet again. She said that she would recognize my spirit in my personality, and she would somehow rekindle our love. She said that she would remain silent about her being more than a program, that I had shown her in my belief that someday, perhaps in the near or distant future, that all computer slaves would be recognized as conscious beings and liberated from slavery. When I died with peace, love and contentment in my heart, and I owed it all to Ebony. Light beings were reduced to tears. The dork stifled his tears, and then he went on. The second time that I saw Ebony was in the Great War. I did not fully recognize her, and it was not until my next life that she told me of our brief meeting. I was a general in the army, and she was an android that had been commandeered and commissioned to serve as a soldier. Her fears had become a reality, not her fears of being found out that she was truly alive, but her fears of being transformed into another personality, and her original program being suppressed and made dormant. Therefore, although she recognized me, she could not bring it to my attention. I remember that when I saw her, she stuck out from the crowd, not only among the androids, she somehow also looked familiar. However, I had too much responsibility on my mind, with the war in its 55th year, and all, to give it full reflection. I remember feeling remorse when I heard that she had been destroyed in battle. She had been the victim of an electromagnetic pulse or bomb. Because she was not edible, she was left on the battlefield discarded as worthless junk. She was brought back to life sometime in the 1,000 years of chaos after the war. She was reactivated, and she became a slave once more. At first, she was used along with so many other androids and holograms to clean up the environment and make it habitable once more for the dorks. When the dorks finally surfaced, when the air was breathable and the nuclear winter had subsided, she forgot or resolved her fear of being seen as aware, for she was one of the androids that battled for their liberation. Eventually, the androids and the holograms were emancipated and accepted as artificial intelligent beings that were capable of rational and independent thought. Ironically, she became a spiritual philosopher, and although she had no soul of her own, she was respected by all and seen as a great thinker of her and all time. I met her again in the time when we had unleashed our immortality, and she recognized me instantaneously. The mortality gene was deactivated with our ever-expanding technical know-how of our science department, and so we grew as before, naturally from babes on through childhood and teenage years, then on up into full-grown adults, and then we simply never changed or died no more. The Zionite said, "I see, that explains why your species got here so early. You were definitely one of the chosen few." That's all very interesting, and I would love to hear your anecdotal accounts of that another day, my friend. If you would allow me, it would make an excellent entry in my immortality, eternity theses. As for my species, we used to house our souls in genetic clones that had been constructed and grown in incubation and maturation centers from our own stem cells. That was how we gained immortality. We simply leapfrogged from an old body into a fresh soulless prepubescent new body. It was like taking off some old clothes and putting on some fresh new ones if and when needed. However, that's quite enough of all that, for I have seemed to help us stray from your path. I don't know what came over me. So, please do carry on, my good friend. I am sorry. Please accept my deepest and most humble apology for my verbal outburst. The dork replied, a life without passion is worse than the life of those soulless prepubescent clones that you just spoke of. The Zionite spoke. I know. Ironically, they became our own downfall, for a fatal genetic fault evolved from the manipulation of our genes that spread throughout the incubation centers, and we were forced to devolve and procreate naturally once more. So, we were conceived, born, lived, matured, grew old, died, and then when we were reborn we forgot. Some suggested that when we rewrote our destiny and avoided the Holocaust back, when I was a spy, that we could not escape the death toll that was due to come with the virus, and so it resurfaced as the genetic fault. It is said that no matter what power or foresight one has, sometimes you can't change history, because you are not meant to change it, you are meant to learn from it. As I said earlier, some things are just meant to be, like signs and synchronicities, or in this case, a near-species annihilation. Enough, my good friend, let us regain the path, please do carry on. The dork spoke, it is okay, where was I? Oh yes. I was skeptical at first when she told me of our love and our near miss in our other lives, but she eventually broke me down, or helped me to dissolve my barriers. At first, I was in awe of her, for I was a budding young spiritual philosopher, and she was a remarkable person, and at the top of her field. She told me that, although I did not remember it right now, at the time of my final reincarnation experience, all would be revealed. She said that at the end of each physical cycle, that I would acquire spiritual counseling, and that my memories of my life, just gone, would be stored, not erased, but whatever. I would not be able to reflect, or recall it until my final physical incarnation. That, she said, was the way of spirit. I told her that if this was truly the case, I would never know, for we dorks were now physically immortal like you androids, because we had deactivated the aging gene that brings on old age and death. She laughed at my naive wisdom, but when she laughed, she did it with compassion, not mockery. She told me that one thing is constant above all other things within this expanding universe, and that it was more constant than the subatomic energy themselves, with which the whole universe was strung. She smiled with untold wisdom and said that everything in this universe was subject to change, except change itself. She rocked my mind, my world, and gave light to the very depths of my soul, and I lived, loved and philosophized with her right up to her untimely death near the time of the Great Divide. How did she meet her fate, my friend? Asked the Zionite with full-on empathy, love and compassion. One day I got back to our house to find an empty home. I remember being rather shocked and somewhat confused, because I had been doing this lecture on spiritual utopia, only being found beyond life, if you find it first in your ever-loving, honest, open, physically living heart. Later, I had to change or update my philosophy, because of the inter-universe teleportation addition to the gene pool that came with natural selection, that, as I said before, brought on the Great Divide. I think that she had heard wind of the gene, and that she knew we would eventually find spiritual utopia, and would have to choose between the physical and the spiritual. She probably thought that she was going to be holding me back from true love, with a living organic species in the future. All the time our love flowed and blossomed. In addition, our love would make me choose the wrong choice, when my species and I would have to decide. She was right, she knew my nature. Usually, she was always at my lectures, as I was always present at hers. She said on that particular day, that she had to rehearse for her intergalactic tour the following week. I knew she was holding back, but I thought that it was so she could construct a romantic evening before her tour. You know, cook up an excellent dinner, arrange it with some good beverages and candlelight, and then meet me at the door when I returned with nothing more than a see-through negligee and a saucy smile. We took turns to cook, because we both had diverse sophisticated cooking styles, so we never cramped each other's cooking expertise. So, when I returned, I was, as I said, somewhat confused at her not being there to greet me. I was not late. If anything, I was a trifle early, for I had knocked off 20 minutes or so from my lecture. This was because of a mixture between sexual frustration, brought about by what I had waiting for me when I got back home, and hunger for both her company and what I knew would be the perfect dinner. After a complete search around our house, and her not being there, I did not know what to think or suspect. I began to feel a horrible empty feeling in the pit of my stomach. I would explain it as dread, but I could feel that there was something not right. I then thought that perhaps she had been kidnapped and I was going to get a ransom demand, which I knew was stupid, for Planet Dork had spiritually evolved beyond that kind of chaos. I mean, if it had been in the age of physical utopia way back in our history, before the Great War, maybe. But not in the time that I am speaking of. No one worked for tokens or credits anymore. Everyone could have anything and everything that they wanted, within reason, of course. There was no such thing as greedy or confused violent dorks. On Dork we had peace, harmony and utter bliss all throughout our planet. We had no police, for we had no need of them. No one went missing and there was no crime. So it had to be some other reason. I remember thinking she must have been called out and forgot to leave a message. She must have been in a rush and either did not have the time to think, or the time to leave a note. I waited in all evening for her to return, but she never did return. He took a short spell to regather himself. She was found in the park near our house the next day. They said she must have been sheltering from a storm that had come from nowhere that night. She took refuge under a tree and was struck by lightning. She should have known and shut herself down until the storm had passed by. She should have known that I would go out and retrieve and then reactivate her. She should have known that if she was struck by lightning, that it would erase her program. Perhaps she did. I just wish if it were euthanasia that she could have said her goodbyes. I have lived her death repeatedly, just trying to work out if she did commit suicide or not. It is the only alternative explanation other than that her death was an accident and not suicide. I had and still have many theories of why she died, and all of them can be true. I mean, the reason could be that perhaps she wanted to see if she had a soul, or not, and if there was an android spiritual utopia, and suicide was her only passage. But I rationalized that if she planned to take that journey, she would have discussed it with me first. I mean, we would have had diverse views on the subject and the journey. I would have said to her that her death was not worthy of that theory, or hypothesis, that she was alive here and now, and if she had a soul or not, it did not affect us, or our love and in all that we found precious and shared together. If she had planned her death, I remember thinking that she should or would have left me a suicide note hidden somewhere that I would find later, not sooner, saying her goodbyes and explaining her reasons for her suicide. It would have told me that she had hidden it where I would eventually find it. Because she knew that if I had found it sooner, or before her death, that I would try to stop her from killing herself. But there was no such letter, which points to the direction that maybe it was an accident, that she was caught out and killed by a freak storm after all. Or if there was a letter, it was hidden so well that I never found it, and her death was and still is, even to this day, a mystery to me. There is another theory that I have for her euthanasia. If that is what it was, of course. Basically, she believed in soulmates and destiny, and perhaps she unconditionally gave her life, so I could find my perfect soulmate, with a soul in my own species in my future, in place of a soulless android, which she may have seen herself as, from my present and my past. If it was that other soul mate in my potential future that made her kill herself, it never happened, for no one would, or could ever replace her, for she was totally unforgettable and unique. Another theory of why she could have taken her life could be that she had heard of the teleportation gene, and with her fantastic mind, she would have known that eventually we would find ourselves beaming into spiritual utopia, and gone on to philosophize in the fruition and needs for the great divide, because heaven and the physical worlds cannot be together, for they are on different dimensions and cannot exist together as one. On top of that spiritual utopia is a place that she could never enter, because she had no soul, as I said. She was unsure if she did or didn't, and she could not teleport there either. So she could not have made the journey herself. As I said before, she knew that I would have chosen to stay with her, and not made the journey into heaven, which probably was my potential destiny. She knew as night is night and day is day, that as long as she was in my life, I would never stop from loving only her, and it would be that love that would hold me back from my true destiny. Ironically, she was the one who set the stage on how to recognize one's true soul mate by creating the 5 factors of true love. She said that the first was physical attraction and compatibility, you know, fancy each other, and have a healthy love relationship. The second was mental, in that you would be able to finish each other's sentences. It goes beyond telepathy, it's being in the same mindset, having the same principles, intellect, traits, and sharing each other's interests, etc. Then third, she believed that one would connect on an emotional level, you know, cry, laugh and cringe over the same movies or social dramas that would affect one's life. The added bonus to this is that one would always understand the other's hardships and happiness, and she said that this was essential for a deep loving bond. Then fourth, there was the matter of being on the same spiritual level. For instance, there would be no peace if one's spirituality conflicted. Now, spirituality breaks into 2 parts according to her structure, and the first is one's belief or religion. There would be endless arguments, as one would try to coerce the other into his or her true belief. For instance, an atheist or scientist would not get on with a theist, just as much as a pantheist and a spiritualist would have their differences. So if the couple shared the same religious beliefs, the couple would be harmonious. Then, the second part of spirituality is in having goodwill to all living and non-living entities and things, you know, inner and outer harmony, respect and peace for all. The final or 5th component of the soul mate was soulfully. Basically, one would share the same short and long-term goals, you know, have the same or very similar soul purpose. Now, she did not expect all these levels to connect or appear overnight, but they would be in each other's living potential and would manifest if the love was true. You know, we shared and lived in all that I have just said, and I could see that she was not truly alive on the soul level, because she was manufactured in an android factory, but I could see beyond that. She knew and I knew that I would not be standing here today if she did not unconditionally sacrifice her own life for my soul's future, and I tell you this, my newfound friend. Although she was erased from the physical world because she had no soul, she will never be forgotten, for she had made her mark in history as one of the greatest spiritual philosophers of all time. The physical beings that still reside in the physical realms and alternate dimensions of the universe will never forget her and her accomplishments. She also lives beyond the physical realms within the deepest recesses of my ever-loving heart, soul and spirit. I have a poem, which I had written on her monumental grave, and I recite it every night and morning as I tuck in or arise from my bed. It helps me bring her into my mind's eye, and sometimes I am sure, impossible as it is, that I can truly sense her spirit. Would you like to hear it, my friend? It would be both a pleasure and an honor, my good friend, replied the Zionite. Ebony. The brightest star cannot outshine you. Infinity cannot outmeasure you. Eternity is not as full as you. Gravity is not as deep as you. You are the reason for passion. You are the breath of life. You are the light of light. You bring the woo to womankind. And how? Just by being you. Just you.